How would you compare, I mean, they're two totally different vocalists. How would you compare Eddie Vedder to Layne Staley?
I think Eddie was still sort of finding his voice in the band. I mean, it was a new band, and my sense was he was still finding his voice in general, and he was finding his voice in the band. So I think it took more work. My experience with recording Pearl Jam then was that Eddie had to do a lot of takes. We would do many takes, compile the best of, and I guess, I'm trying to think now, because I worked with them a couple times. It was all back in the day, but the second time they came back, he knew more what he wanted, and I could see that progression where he was, and I've been around enough artists, like I've gotten to work with Brandi Carlile a lot over the years, and someone like her, I've worked with her when she was really young, and then I've worked with her a couple times since she's toured the world. And when after they tour the world, musicians, they just come back a new artist, really. So, for example, with Brandi, the last time I worked with Brandi, she just, one take, it's done. When I first started working with her when she was really young, it was like kind of a struggle. So that was my impression with Eddie, was that when I got to work with him, he was still figuring it out. And now later, and I didn't know, I can listen to them play live. It's like, oh, he knows exactly what he's doing now. Yeah. Where I think Layne was already there. When I worked with Layne back in the day, he already knew exactly what he was doing. And that's why he could pull off. He was doing those takes often just in one take.
So in general, from your experience, what was different about working with Pearl Jam and working with Alice in Chains?
The difference between working with Pearl Jam and Alice in Chains is I think both bands were at the same place of like making major, career decisions with their bands, because they both were launching at that time. So it was super intense for all the bands, both those bands. But Pearl Jam wasn't like, their atmosphere wasn't so like party, silly, goofy. It was much more business-like. But they didn't give me they didn't pay much more attention to me in any different way. Although I will say, Mike McCready did. Mike McCready was the guy that like pulled me aside and asked me like how long I worked there, and like kind of like got to know me a little bit. So that's how it stands out to me, is like Mike McCready was like that, and Layne was like that. They were the two guys in both those bands that like actually was interested in this young kid that was there basically to get them coffee or do whatever. And from what I know about history books too, it's like that was kind of the two different bands. Pearl Jam was kind of more business minded. So it didn't seem like there wasn't like this goofy locker room vibe as much with Pearl Jam as it was with Alice in Chains. It was like it was a comedy show all the time.
So I guess Pearl Jam were more straightforward, so to speak?
They were much more professional and polite, but I wouldn't say they were any more interested in me. As again, I'm working for the studio. So when they show up to the studio, I'm the guy that they're going to see, and they're going to need stuff. They're going to need coffee. They're going to need to know where to put their amps or whatever. And what's interesting about that era of London Bridge, which is pretty unique, I guess no one really talks about this, but like most studios, even nowadays too, like if you're a big band, you go to a studio in LA, there's going to be runners, there's going to be techs, there's a whole infrastructure of how a studio is going to run. There's a ladder, there's the runner who they don't even step into the control room. They're outside of the studio, but they're there to go get food and whatever. And then there's an assistant engineer, and there's an engineer, and there's a producer, and it's a whole hierarchy. At London Bridge, there was none of that. It was me and whoever was producing. So like when it was Toby, it was me and Toby. So I was playing all these roles. I was the runner. I was the assistant engineer. And that's kind of like in LA, that's kind of unheard of, and making, these are major label records we're making with like big budgets, but it was just Toby and I. So like if Toby needed coffee, I'd go get coffee. If Toby needed a microphone plugged in, I'd go plug that microphone in. If Toby had to take a break, I would be the one running the tape deck. So it was like really extraordinary for me because I was playing all these different roles. But it's pretty unusual. Like I could maybe imagine the band might be a little bit like frustrating for them because they're maybe used to having all this infrastructure. But at London Bridge, typically that stuff just wasn't there. But maybe that's what made the process special.
So in terms of special, aside from what we've already spoken about, do you have any special memories from your time working with either Pearl Jam or Alice in Chains?
I do have a really funny Mike Starr story. So actually, this is one of the first things I think, my very first encounter with Alice in Chains with Mike Starr. And this was SAP. So they'd already recorded most of the parts. And I didn't know anything. I just was there, And Mike Starr shows up, and it was just Mike and I. And I remember, I think I helped him get his bass set up a little bit. And I was like, well, what are we doing today? And he's like, well, I got to play bass on a song that Jerry played bass on. And Jerry did a killer job. I'm totally happy with the bass part. But my mom, I know my mom's going to know that I didn't play bass on that, and she's going to be pissed. And so I just, for my mom's sake, I got to go back and re-record the bass part myself. So he basically replaced what Jerry, it was the same bass part, but Mike Starr just played it himself. And he explained it to me that like he was going to be guilty because his mom would find out. I just thought that was really funny.
That's hilarious. That's so cool.
But Mike Starr seemed to be, he was kind of like within the party kind of atmosphere as well.
And what about Sean Kinney? How was he like?
He was awesome. He was hilarious, and he'd walk in, he was just like a hurricane, you know. Sean was great. Really fun. But again, like from my perspective now, he wasn't like someone that really like got to know me. He just was funny. He was like a comedian, you know. It was basically like hanging out with like a stand-up comedian all day long.